miracles is, how do you prove it? A lot of miracles that we read about from biblical stories happened at the time of those prophets. Jesus bringing somebody back from the dead, for example. If you weren't there, you have no real way of knowing that actually happened. Moses parted the seas, but again, how do you know that was true? You can read about it and you can believe in it, you can have faith, but how do you actually know that that is true? And that is one of the problems that religions do have. However, with Islam, we have a living miracle, and I'll come to that next. Firstly, a little briefer about the Quran. It was revealed right here in Mecca. I'm currently in the Grand Mosque in Saudi Arabia, and the Kaaba is in that direction. I can't actually show you the Kaaba because of the coronavirus. They actually closed down large parts of the mosque to actually clean it and disinfect it. But just a bit of a briefer, the Quran was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, when he was around 40 years old, and it was revealed over the course of 23 years. So the Prophet passed away when he was around 63 years old, and the Quran itself was not revealed in one go. It was revealed piece by piece, and usually in response to questions that were being asked to him or situations that were taking place around and with the Muslims at the time. So it covers a whole breadth of things. I mean, it really, as Muslims, we believe it's a guide for life. There's nothing that you would experience in your life that would not be covered, and that's from a personal perspective, commercial perspective, governmental, environmental, whatever the issue is, whatever the concern is, the Quran is a source that you can go back to and get knowledge, understanding, wisdom to deal with any sort of situation. But that's all well and good. I mean, it's probably picturing it as a sort of an interesting book, quite helpful. But what makes it miraculous? And the first thing that I'd like to highlight is the scientific miracles that are in the Quran itself. And these are things that have been there for 1400 years. So, the Quran itself, one of the important things you need to remember is the Quran has not changed. Muslim scholars are in complete agreement with that. Even non-Muslim scholars are also in agreement with that. If you go to any of the main governing bodies for any of the religions, world religions, be it the Vatican for Roman Catholics, or any of the world religions, they will all say that the Quran has not changed. They agree on that. That's kind of unanimous. So if the Quran has not changed, what are the miracles that are inside it? So the first one that I want to highlight is embryology, and this I feel is such a powerful one because, well, let me tell you the story. Professor Keith Moore, he was the specialist in embryology at the University of Toronto. He was invited here to Saudi Arabia. This is back in the late 70s, I think it was, or early 80s. And he was invited over here, and he was given access to all the Quranic verses to do with embryology and the development of the embryo and the birth of the baby and things of that nature. And there's a fair few verses which I would say, at a guess, I would say 20 to 30 verses that specifically talk about embryology in some quite detail. Anyhow, so he was given access to all the material that he wanted and access to translators, and essentially his brief was, look into these verses and tell us how accurate that they are. So he did that over a period of time, and he published his conclusions. Now, he had written the textbooks that were used in Canada at the time, and I think in the US as well, but certainly within Canada, to do with embryology. He was the expert on embryology at his time. And what he found was so amazing to him that he decided to create a new version of his textbook and include the Quranic verses in that, saying that this is information that was just not known. and it predated scientific knowledge of the current time. So when he presented his findings, he held a news conference back in Toronto, and the journalists who were there, they were asking very odd questions. I mean, they really didn't understand any of this, and they said, well, these Arabs, is it not possible that they just dissected mothers at the time who were pregnant? They looked at all this information, and then they wrote it down and they gave it to the Prophet, peace be upon him. And what he said in reply was that you have to understand that all of the slides that I've shown you, all of the images were taken with microscopes. The microscope had only been invented 200 or 300 years previous. So he said, either you're saying that they created a microscope, done these crude dissections, wrote all this information down, knew that it was then true, and then destroyed the microscope for another 1100 years, and then somebody else rediscovered the microscope again. And so he was asked the question, how do you think that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, got this information? And he said, well, it could only have been revealed, because it was information that was just not known at the time. Now, that in itself is pretty amazing, okay? You might say it's a miracle, you might not agree that it's a miracle. It's pretty amazing. But in addition to that, all of the verses on the Quran, in the Quran which were on embryology, they were all 100% accurate. So not only was there new things in the Quran that at the time when it was written was just not known, but at the time where he analyzed it had become known. There were all of the verses that had been revealed on embryology were 100% accurate. Now, that's pretty amazing. Whether you think it's miraculous or not, it's pretty amazing. Embryology is obviously one of those things that is pretty amazing because you couldn't see it at the time, you couldn't guess it, and it's written so accurately. Another example is the way that the universe itself has been created. Now, in terms of the theory of how the universe was created, I think now it's quite well established that the prevailing theory is that it was created from the Big Bang, and this is something that was discovered, I think, about 100 years ago. I think it was Professor Edward Hubble, if I'm not mistaken, but I might be wrong on that. But anyhow, so it was something that's a relatively new discovery. Certainly not 1400 years ago did we not know this. So the fact that the Quran talks about how the universe itself was created in itself is pretty amazing. But it also talks about it quite accurately. So it talks about, in one of the verses in the Quran, it talks about how it would be the unbelievers who will see that the universe was joined as one, and then it was torn asunder, which visually, if you think about that, that kind of indicates what happened with the Big Bang. But it also pretty amazingly, actually, quite accurately says that it would be the unbelievers who would come to find that out. And then the second part of that actually talks about something slightly different, but amazing in itself, is that it talks about how how life, living things are created from water. And certainly, as you're sitting here in Saudi Arabia and surrounded by deserts, you would probably find it quite hard to convince somebody 1400 years ago that all of the living things around here are created of water. It would probably be quite difficult to argue that one. And certainly it's something that, again, is a relatively new discovery, and it's relatively new as in within the last couple of hundred years. But the Quran really predates all of that and talks about these things 1400 years ago, bearing in mind that the Quran itself has not changed in that period of time as well. That's a pretty amazing achievement. But the Quran doesn't actually stop there, because it then continues on in another verse, and it talks about how the universe itself is being expanded and how God is expanding it. So again, it very accurately talks about creating the universe in the method that it is, and the fact that the universe itself is continuing to expand. This is something that is, again, relatively new in terms of scientific understanding. It was not understood that the universe was expanding until they realized that it was, and I won't go into the details of that, but it is quite a commonly held understanding within the scientific community. I don't think anybody disputes that. But again, it's in the Quran 1400 years ago. It's all well and good talking about things out there in the universe, but for many of us, like myself, I'm not a scientist. I don't really understand how the universe works. But geologists back here on Earth have been looking at how the Earth is constructed, and particularly about how mountains play a role in really holding the earth plates together and preventing earthquakes. And the Quran again quite accurately talks about this, and it talks about the role of mountains with pegs in the ground, which again is very accurate in how the Quran itself is, or how the mountains, the function of the mountains are, because they do have pegs in the ground, and that's essentially exactly what they do. If you think about a tent peg, you see a small amount above and a larger portion of it goes into the ground. That is exactly the situation with mountains, and the Quran quite accurately talks about this in verses in the Quran. Another one that today we might actually consider to be fairly obvious is that pain receptors are actually in the skin, and the Quran again talks about this. But this is again something that is obvious today, but was not necessarily obvious 1400 years ago, or even perhaps 300-400 years ago. So again, it talks about the Quran is not a book of science. It's a book which talks about a variety of different things, but when it gives examples and talks of those things, it refers to for example, pain receptors in the skin, and we now know that is accurate, that is 100% true, but this is again a modern understanding. There are so many examples that I could give of miracles in the Quran, and I'll create another video on all about the miracles. I really wanted this one to just be about the reasons why Muslims believe in the Quran itself, and the miracles, the Quranic miracles aside, there's other things also about the Quran which are miraculous as well, which I wanted to highlight. One of those is the fact that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, it's widely acknowledged that he was unlettered. He couldn't read or write. This is something that's quite clear in the Muslim tradition, but also non-Muslim scholars do not disagree with this, the fact that he was unlettered. And the reason why that's so important is because Arabic is a very complicated language, and the Quranic Arabic is even more complicated. Just yesterday I was speaking to somebody who's Lebanese who speaks Arabic, and he was amazed when he found out that I could read Arabic, and he hadn't actually read the Quran in Arabic, and he was amazed by that, the fact that I had. And the reason for that is because the detail that's used in the Quran is really on a different level. The Quranic Arabic is so much more complicated than regular Arabic, and the fact that the Prophet, peace be upon him, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was if he wasn't a prophet and he authored this book, how does somebody who is not able to read or write the language that it's written in able to author a book of this complexity, this much depth, this much detail, over the course of 23 years, and also get everything accurate, correct? That in itself is pretty amazing. I mean, you're not talking about a small book here. It's a very detailed book, So the fact that the Prophet himself was able to pull that off, there's no book in history which, as far as I'm aware, is written by somebody who cannot read or write. Another miracle of the book, and this goes well beyond the actual fact that it's got verses in there which are scientific in nature. But another miracle of the book is the fact that it hasn't actually changed in 1400 years. And again, this isn't something that's in dispute. You might get some people who say, oh, well, it has changed, but I think serious scientists around the world, Muslims and non-Muslims, will all agree that it's an unchanged book. And just recently, a version of the Quran was found, a very early version of the Quran was found in a university library, a university collection. I think it was the University of Birmingham. They found a very early version of the Quran within, I believe, 50 years of the death of the Prophet. And that version of the Quran was the same as what we have today. So the fact that this book hasn't changed, and the reason you might sort of think to yourself, well, that's no big feat, books don't change, but then you look at other books and they have changed. I mean, you look at the Bible, and there's significant differences between the early versions of the Bible and the current version of the Bible. But the Quran hasn't changed, and one of the reasons why it hasn't changed is because the Quran is a book that has been memorized, and I'll come to this point in a second. But even if a word was to change in the Quran, there'll be millions of people around the world who know that Quran off by heart, and they will be able to spot the difference straight away. And the fact that the Quran itself was orally transmitted around the world, there's an oral tradition of learning the Quran, memorizing it. For that reason, it doesn't matter where you go around the world, whether you're in Ethiopia or Australia or the United States or Great Britain, wherever you are around the world, it's the same Quran. They're reading it exactly the same way, down to the letter, down to the dot. And that in itself is pretty amazing. And you're not talking about a small number of people here. You're talking about 20+% of the world's population. So the fact that all of these people know the Quran, that in itself is pretty amazing. Another factor which comes into play is that the Quran, having been written over a course of 23 years, over 23 years I have contradicted myself plenty. I don't write that much, but I mean, certainly in terms of speaking, I'll say one thing today and a year later I'll say something completely different. And that's just human nature. But the Quran is a book that was written or revealed over a 23-year period, yet there are no contradictions in it. So the message that's given at the start, the way that message is delivered, what is being taught to mankind is exactly the same from the beginning to the end. And again, you might sort of think, well, it's a religious book, so of course it's going to be like that, but it's not like that if you look at other religions. I mean, certainly if you look at the Bible, there's a lot of contradictions in there. It'll say something in one place where so-and-so has X number of children, and then in another place it'll say a different number. The Quran doesn't trip up and make those sorts of mistakes. So does that mean that because there's no contradictions, it has to be from God? Of course not. But these are all points which all stack up one upon another to build the case. The Quran also does something which is quite unique in that it gives the reader a challenge. It says to the reader that if you doubt that it comes from God, then produce a chapter like it. And then that was reduced to a sentence, an ayah, which is referred to as a sentence. So the Quran is basically saying that if you think you can do better, then produce one sentence which is better than the sentence that God has created in the Quran itself. Now, this is an open-ended challenge. It's not a case of, do it within, a 1-year period, otherwise, come to accept it. This is an open-ended challenge. So the challenge is still there today, yet no one has been able to replicate or better the quality of what is written in the Quran. As a non-Arab, I've often been amazed by the things that you find in the Quran itself. But as an Arab, I can only imagine that they are even more amazed by what the way that the word is, the way that something is explained, or how a sentence is constructed and things like that. And it's it's an open-ended challenge. So and nobody's been able to beat this challenge up until now. Another thing about the Quran is that it has directly changed people's lives, and you can see this through the course of history, through the Mongols who originally came to kill the Muslims, and were very successful at that, and then they became Muslims, and then after that they completely changed. Or you can see this through everyday stories of people who become Muslims, in their life, and how it has changed them as individuals. Some of them might come from sort of humble backgrounds, some of them might come from criminal backgrounds, some of them might come from, there might be famous people. One who comes to mind is Cat Stevens, for example, famous singer who became a Muslim, and he completely changed his life around. And it's not a one-off story; it's a very common story that you hear, and it's there's been no other book that has done that. To a large extent, people will say that Christianity, people find God through Christianity, and it's changed their lives, and it may well do, but nothing has changed the lives of people like the Quran has. Following on from that, another point is that Quran has created the largest practicing group of people in the world. Currently the estimates are there's about 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, and there's large numbers of Christians in the world as well, and Hindus in the world too. But in terms of practicing Muslims, there's no other religion that has produced close to what Islam has, and it's a relatively new religion. I mean, Christianity started 2,000 years ago. Islam started 1,400 years ago. Yet Islam has created the largest group of practicing Muslims, who pray 5 times a day, who fast the month of Ramadan and carry out the 5 pillars of Islam. So that in itself is quite a huge achievement, and it's not something that's historic. It continues to grow. So Islam is still the fastest growing religion in the world, and that just goes to say a lot about a religion which, if you look at the media, portrays it as one thing, and yet people are still becoming Muslims. So there's obviously something there within the teachings of Islam which really hits the heart of people who are seeking for the truth. The Quran is also quite unique in that it is as complex as it is, and it's written in a language that many of the people who read it do not understand. And I say that about myself as well. I mean, I don't speak Arabic, yet I can read it in a different language. I can read it in the Arabic language. But one of the amazing things about the Quran is that it is easy to memorize, even if you don't speak Arabic. And when I say easy to memorize, I'm talking about millions of people, millions and millions of people around the world who are currently alive and who have memorized it, ignoring the people who have passed away over the years who have memorized it as well. And you're talking about children as young as 8 or 10 in some cases, and as old as 60 and 70, and possibly beyond in other cases. There's no other book that has been memorized in such a way. And one of the beauties of that is, if you were to destroy all literature in the world today, none of it was available tomorrow. The internet was destroyed, libraries were destroyed, bookshops, there was no literature that remained in the world today. The Quran is the only book that you could recreate, and the reason why you could do that is because people have memorized it. So you could sit down 2 people, one from Australia and one from Canada, and you could sit them down and they could recreate the Quran word for word, dot for dot, and have a third person check it, and you would have that Quran back in print form within 24 hours. So that's pretty amazing. And again, it's not a small book, it's a fairly big book. So the fact that that is possible, even, there's nothing else like it out there. Another thing, I mean, if you look at what the media will say, you'll hear a different story, but often people who write these articles or are presenting these things on the news haven't actually read the Quran. And what a lot of people are amazed by when they read the Quran is that there is no crookedness in the Quran itself. The Quran itself sets a very high moral standard, and you couldn't really argue that there's any crookedness that comes out of the Quran. I remember listening to one talk many years ago, and it was an ex-Christian minister who had become a Muslim, and he was speaking to one of his previous colleagues, and that guy was saying, well, the Quran is obviously written by the devil. Okay, it's a fair argument, you could argue that point, but then you'd also have to show within the Quran which part was written by the devil, because there's nothing that's bad for mankind in the book. It teaches you good. And what's more, when we read the Quran, we're told to say, in the Arabic language, but I'll translate it, we're told to say, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, which means, I seek refuge in God from Satan, the accursed. Would Satan write a book which would say, seek refuge in God from me? Because that's what we read every time we read the Quran. So the argument that it's written by Satan, you would all first of all have to show where the crookedness is, but also how would Satan actually put that in the book? It just doesn't make any sense. So again, the fact that it's a book of how to do good would indicate that it's come from a good source, and that source we would say is quite clearly God. The miracles within the Quran, I mean, I could really create another video, and I will do about that, but you know, assuming that, you know, they are true, the miracles are accurate and they came from really what could only have come from God, a revelation, then that means then that the Quran itself is a revelation, it's from God. And in the Quran, God actually says that the Quran is produced for mankind. You know, the Lord of the worlds has produced this book. So if God is saying that he has created this book, and there's plenty of evidence in there to show that the book came from God, then again, would God be lying about that? Obviously not. I mean, the book is from God. So again, that's another one of the reasons why, you know, we have the confirmation that the Quran is from God, and you know, when within that confirmation God is saying that he's produced this book for mankind, we have no reason to not believe that. One interesting point about the word confirmation, in a lot of religions they talk about faith and, you know, how you should have faith, and quite often you read in Islamic literature as well, sort of modern day Islamic literature about, you know, having faith. And I find the word faith problematic on two fronts. First of all, faith means to believe something even if you can't prove it to be true. You have faith in that. And the second reason why I have a problem with it is because the word that is often used for faith in Arabic is iman. Iman is often translated as faith, but actually the word iman doesn't mean faith. In Arabic we have what are called root words, so a word is taken from another word, and the root word is the sort of where the meaning comes from. And the word iman, which is translated as faith, it actually comes from amana, which means confirmation. So in Islam we are taught to build our iman, and you build that based on things being confirmed to you. So it's not blind faith, as you often find in other religions. It's actually looking into it, and Islam tells us, the Quran tells us to do this, that if you don't believe, look into it. And then you will come to understand that it's true, and then you will come to believe. And that's exactly how Iman worked. It's taking one layer of confirmation and adding another layer of confirmation on top of that. And that's the argument really that I'm building as well in what I'm explaining here, is that, you know, there's a lot of different factors which show that God exists, that the Quran is from God. Finally, the Quran, Allah reveals a very important verse in the Quran as well, where towards the final verses, it says that on this day I have chosen your path, essentially, and your religion, and that is Islam. And that's very important, because if you come to the understanding that the Quran is a message from God, then what follows from that, which is included in and embedded in that message, is that Islam is that way of life that mankind should follow. So if you found this video interesting, please subscribe and give us a thumbs up if you like the video, and I look forward to producing more videos on this topic and similar topics for you. Thanks very much.